The dust hadn't even settled when Jim Bridger threw himself between the charging cattle and the boy. He grabbed young Miguel by his fancy embroidered collar and yanked him behind a water trough just as 3,000 pounds of angry beef thundered past. The kid was shaking like a leaf, his face white as milk. That was how Jim ended up at Don Miguel Castillo's grand hacienda 3 days later, standing in a room that probably cost more than everything he'd owned in his whole life. Crystal chandeliers hung from the ceiling. The floors were so shiny he could see his own dusty boots reflected back at him. He felt like a prairie dog at a cat convention. Don Miguel was a big man with a bigger mustache and the kind of voice that filled every corner of a room. He stood at the head of a long table covered in more food than Jim had seen in months. Roasted meats, fresh bread, fruits Jim couldn't even name. His stomach growled, but he kept his face neutral. "Senor Bridger," Don Miguel boomed, raising a glass of wine that sparkled in the lamplight. "You saved my son's life." "My only son. There's no price I can put on such a debt." Jim shifted his weight from one foot to the other. He wasn't comfortable with all this fancy gratitude. He'd done what any decent person would do. "No debt, sir. The boy just needed help." "But I insist," Don Miguel continued, and something in his tone said this wasn't really a discussion. "I am offering you a reward that few men would refuse. You may choose any woman from my household to be your wife. Along with this, I give you 200 acres of good grazing land and 50 head of cattle to start your own herd." The room went silent. Every eye turned to Jim. He could feel them all staring, judging, waiting to see what the rough cowboy would do with such an offer. His collar suddenly felt too tight. 3 young women were brought forward. They were Don Miguel's nieces, he explained. Pretty girls in beautiful dresses with ribbons in their dark hair. They smiled at Jim with painted lips, but their eyes were cautious. This wasn't really their choice either, he realized. They were just doing what was expected. Jim looked at them and felt a weight in his chest. Marriage wasn't something he'd thought much about. His days were spent mending fences, herding cattle, and trying to keep his small piece of land from falling apart. A wife, especially one of these fine ladies, would expect things he couldn't give. A big house, nice dresses, a life that didn't involve fixing broken wagon wheels in the rain. As Don Miguel started describing each young woman's accomplishments, Jim's attention drifted. Movement caught his eye near the far doorway. Someone was there in the shadows, separate from all the celebration. He squinted and saw a young woman carrying a heavy water pitcher. Her clothes were simple, dirty even. Her long black hair hung loose and tangled, and on her wrists he saw iron shackles connected by a short chain. She moved like a ghost, trying not to be noticed. Her eyes stayed down, fixed on the floor. But Jim noticed something else, the way she held herself straight back despite the chains, like she refused to be broken even though someone had clearly tried. "That one," Jim said quietly, pointing. "Who's she?" The room went dead silent. You could have heard a pin drop on that fancy carpet. Don Miguel's smile faded. That is no one, Senor Bridger. A Comanche captive. She works in the kitchens. Surely you would prefer one of these lovely—" "What's her name?" Jim interrupted. He didn't usually cut people off, especially important men, but something about the situation made his jaw tight. Don Miguel looked annoyed now. "We call her Nahate. It means stubborn, I believe. Fitting, as she refused to cooperate when we first acquired her. Now, as I was saying about my niece Maria, I'll take her," Jim said. The words came out before he'd fully thought them through. But once they were out there, he knew he meant them. "The Comanche woman. Nahate. That's who I choose." The silence was so thick you could cut it with a knife. Then everyone started talking at once. Don Miguel's face turned red. His wife looked scandalized. The 3 nieces looked relieved, then confused, then offended. Eduardo, the son Jim had saved, stared at him like he'd grown a second head. "You cannot be serious," Don Miguel said, his voice dropping low and dangerous. "She is nothing, a savage. She does not speak proper Spanish or English. She has no dowry, no family name, no—" "She's a person," Jim said simply. "And if I'm choosing, I choose her. You offered any woman in your household. Well, she's in your household, ain't she?" Don Miguel's jaw worked like he was chewing on words he couldn't spit out. His honor was at stake now. He'd made a public promise in front of all these witnesses. A man like him lived and died by his word, Jim knew that. Finally, Don Miguel gave one sharp nod. "Very well. But do not come crying to me when you realize what a foolish choice you have made. Eduardo, have the woman prepared. Give her to this fool cowboy. They brought Nahate forward. She kept her eyes down, her face blank. Jim wondered what she was thinking, being handed from one owner to another like a horse or a sack of grain. Up close, he could see she was younger than he'd first thought. Maybe 20 or so. Her face was smudged with ash and dirt, but her eyes, when she finally lifted them to meet his, were sharp and intelligent, and full of fear, though she was trying hard to hide it. The shackles on her wrists had rubbed her skin raw. Dried blood crusted at the edges. Jim felt anger rise in his throat, but swallowed it down. Getting mad wouldn't help her now. Can you remove the chains? Jim asked. Don Miguel waved his hand dismissively. When you leave. She is a runner. She tried to escape twice in the first month. The chains stay until she is your problem, not mine. They gave Jim papers, some kind of transfer of ownership that made him sick to read, but that he signed anyway, because it meant he could get her out of there. They loaded Nahate onto a horse, gave Jim his cattle papers and land deed, and sent them on their way as the sun was setting. As they rode away from that grand hacienda with all its glittering lights, Jim glanced back once. Nahate was looking back too, her face unreadable. He wondered what she saw when she looked at him. Another captor? Another man who would hurt her? He didn't know how to tell her that wasn't what he wanted. Hell, he didn't even know what he wanted. He just knew that leaving her there in chains hadn't been something he could do. The first stars were coming out as they rode into the darkness together, two strangers bound by one man's strange choice, heading toward a future neither of them could predict. The first night they barely spoke. Jim found a clearing near a creek and set up a simple camp. He started a fire while Nahate sat on the ground, still in those chains, watching him with eyes that missed nothing. Every movement he made she tracked. Like a wild animal calculating escape routes, he heated up some beans and bacon in his old tin pot, the same one he'd been using for 5 years. When it was ready, he spooned half onto a plate and held it out to her. She stared at it but didn't move. It's food, Jim said quietly. You must be hungry. Still, she didn't take it. He realized she probably thought it was some kind of test or trick. So he set the plate down on a rock near her, backed away and ate his own portion. Only then did she reach for it, moving slow, waiting for him to stop her. When he didn't, she ate quickly, like someone who'd learned to finish meals fast before they got taken away. After dinner, Jim pulled out a key that Don Miguel's man had given him. I'm going to take those off now, he said, pointing at the shackles. All right? She went rigid, her eyes darting to the darkness beyond the firelight. She thought about running. He could see it plain as day on her face. You can run if you want, Jim said, surprising himself. I won't chase you. But it's dark and there's dangerous animals out here. Wolves. Mountain lions. You'd be safer staying till morning at least. Then you can decide. He unlocked the shackles and pulled them off. The skin underneath was raw and angry red. Some spots were infected, oozing. Jim felt his anger rise again at people who could do this to another person. But he kept his face calm. Getting emotional would just scare her more. Wait here, he said, holding up one hand. He went to his saddlebag and pulled out a small tin of salve he used on rope burns. He also grabbed his canteen. When he came back, she'd moved 3 feet farther from the fire. Testing. Seeing if he'd meant what he said about not chasing her. He set the salve down between them. For your wrists. It'll help with the pain. He demonstrated on his own hand, rubbing the salve on his knuckles, then pointed at her wrists. She understood. Slowly, she reached for the tin and applied it herself. Her face stayed blank, but he saw her shoulders relax just a tiny bit when the cooling salve hit her raw skin. That night, Jim gave her his only blanket and slept by the fire with his saddle as a pillow. He heard her stay awake for hours, probably waiting for him to try something. But he just added wood to the fire occasionally and let her be. Eventually, he heard her breathing change as she finally fell asleep. The second day was warmer. They rode side by side, and Jim tried to make simple conversation. He pointed at things and said their names. Tree, rock, sky, horse. She listened but didn't repeat the words. She did watch him, though, still trying to figure him out. Around midday, they stopped to water the horses at a stream. Jim pulled out some dried beef and offered her half. This time, she took it directly from his hand. Progress, Jim, he said, pointing at himself. My name is Jim. She looked at him for a long moment. Then, so quiet he almost missed it, she said, Nahate. He smiled. Nahate, that's a good name. Don Miguel said it means stubborn, but I bet that's not the real meaning, is it? She didn't answer, but something flickered in her eyes, maybe surprised that he cared enough to ask. That evening, Jim caught a rabbit and roasted it over the fire. While it cooked, he pulled out a small knife and started carving a piece of wood. Just something to do with his hands. Nahate watched him work. After a while, he held out the knife handle first. "Want to try?" he asked. She shook her head quickly, pulling back. Of course, he thought. A knife was a weapon. She probably thought he was testing whether she'd try to stab him. "All right," Jim said, easy-like, and went back to his carving. He made a simple horse, nothing fancy, and set it on a rock between them. "For you," he said. "If you want it." She stared at the little wooden horse for a long time. When Jim laid down to sleep that night, he noticed it was gone. She'd taken it. The third day started with distant thunder. Dark clouds rolled in from the west, promising a storm. They needed to cover ground before it hit, so they rode faster. By afternoon, the sky had turned greenish-gray and the wind picked up, carrying the smell of rain. Jim was looking for shelter when Nahate suddenly grabbed his arm. He nearly jumped out of his skin. It was the first time she'd touched him willingly. She pointed east, her face urgent. She said something in Comanche, words he didn't understand, but her tone was clear. Danger. He looked where she pointed, but saw nothing. Still, something in her eyes made him trust her instinct. "What is it?" he asked. She struggled for the English words. "Men," she finally said. "Bad men." Jim's hand went to his rifle. "How many?" She held up 4 fingers. "You sure?" She nodded, absolutely certain. They quickly moved the horses into a thick cluster of rocks and brush, a natural fort of sorts. Jim checked his rifle, his pistol. He had maybe 30 bullets total. Better make them count. They didn't have to wait long. 4 riders appeared on the horizon just as the first raindrops fell. They were rough-looking men, the kind who lived by taking from others. Raiders, bandits, whatever you wanted to call them. Jim had run into their type before. The men spotted their tracks and followed them right to the rocks. "Hey there," one of them called out, his voice oily and false-friendly. "Saw your fire last night. Thought we might share your camp tonight, weather being what it is." "Camp's full," Jim called back. "Move along," the man laughed. "Now that's not very neighborly. We just want to get out of the rain, and maybe you could share whatever else you got. Food, supplies." His eyes found Nahate and his smile turned nasty. Companionship. Jim felt Nahate tense beside him. "Last chance," Jim said, his voice hard. "Ride on." Instead, the men spread out, trying to surround their position. Big mistake. These weren't trained soldiers. They were just thieves who'd gotten cocky. Jim fired a warning shot that kicked up dirt near the leader's horse. The animal reared, nearly throwing its rider. "Next one won't be a warning," Jim shouted. That's when Nahate did something that surprised him. She started yelling in Comanche, her voice cutting through the wind and rain. Jim didn't know what she said, but her tone was fierce, challenging. One of the raiders, a younger guy, went pale. He said something to the leader, urgent and scared. The leader hesitated, looking between Jim's rifle and Nahate's defiant face. Whatever she'd said had shaken them. Maybe she'd claimed to be from a powerful band. Maybe she'd threatened them with revenge. Jim didn't know, but it worked. "Not worth it," the leader finally muttered. They turned their horses and rode off into the storm. Jim and Nahate stayed hidden until the riders were long gone. The storm hit full force then, rain coming down in sheets. They huddled under an overhang, close together for the first time, sharing body heat as the temperature dropped. Jim noticed Nahate was shivering. He opened his coat and gestured for her to come closer. She hesitated, then moved into the shelter of his coat. Not quite touching, but close enough to share warmth. "Thank you," Jim said over the sound of the rain. "For the warning. You saved us both." She looked up at him, really looked at him for the first time. In her eyes, he saw the beginning of something. Not trust, not yet. But maybe the possibility of it, the first crack in the wall she'd built around herself. They rode into Jim's homestead the next afternoon, both of them tired, muddy, and hungry. But something had changed between them during those 3 days. They weren't strangers anymore. They were 2 people who'd watched each other's backs when it mattered. And that, Jim thought as he helped her down from her horse, was something to build on. Jim's homestead wasn't much to look at. A small cabin with a stone chimney, a barn that leaned slightly to the left, a chicken coop, and a well. About 50 acres of decent grazing land stretched out behind it, with a creek running through the back section. It was simple, rough, and honest. Everything Jim owned he'd built with his own 2 hands. Nahate stood in the yard, taking it all in. Jim tried to see it through her eyes and winced. After Don Miguel's grand hacienda, this must look like poverty. But if she was disappointed, her face didn't show it. She just observed everything with that same careful attention she gave to everything. "Come on," Jim said, leading her to the cabin. "I'll show you inside." The cabin was one room divided by a curtain. On one side was a bed with a real mattress that Jim had saved up 6 months to buy. On the other side was a table, 2 chairs, a wood stove, and shelves holding his few possessions. Books his mother had owned before she died, a photograph of his parents in a cracked frame. Cooking supplies. It was clean but sparse. Jim pulled the curtain back to show the sleeping area. "This is yours," he said. "I'll sleep in the barn." Nahate looked at him, confused. She said something in Comanche, a question in her tone. Jim wished he knew what she was asking, but he could guess. Why wasn't he demanding she share the bed? That's what a husband would do, and Don Miguel had given her to him as a wife. But Jim couldn't think of it that way. She hadn't chosen this. She hadn't chosen him. "You need privacy," he said, pointing at the curtain. "This is your space. Nobody will bother you here, I promise." She stared at him for a long moment, then gave a small nod. Still wary, still careful, but maybe starting to believe he meant what he said. Over the next few days, they fell into an awkward routine. Jim woke before dawn to tend the cattle and horses. Nahate woke with him, watching from the cabin window. By the time he came back for breakfast, she'd started the fire in the stove. She didn't know how to cook the way he did, but she'd boil water and set out what food she could find. Coffee if they had it, dried beef, bread from town that was going stale. Jim tried to show her how he liked things done, but quickly realized she had her own way of doing everything. She was smart and capable. She just did things differently. When he showed her how to milk the cow, she mastered it in 2 tries. When he demonstrated using the water pump, she understood immediately and could fix it when it stuck, which it did often. The language barrier frustrated both of them. Jim would point at something and say the English word. Nahate would sometimes repeat it, sometimes offer the Comanche word in return. Slowly, painfully slowly, they built a shared vocabulary. Water, food, fire, yes, no, careful, danger. One evening about a week in, Jim pulled out his mother's Bible. It was one of the few things he had left of his family. He couldn't bring himself to read it much since they'd died. Too many memories. But it was the only book he owned, and if Nahate was going to learn English, she needed to read. He sat at the table and gestured for her to join him. She did, cautious as always. He opened to the first page and pointed at the words. "In the beginning," he read slowly. Then he pointed at each word. "In the beginning." She leaned closer, studying the letters. Her finger traced the words. She tried to repeat them, her accent thick but her effort genuine. "In the beginning." "Good," Jim said, smiling. "That's real good, Nahate." They spent an hour that night on just 3 lines. It wasn't much, but it was a start. When they finished, Nahate looked at him and said one of the few English phrases she'd mastered. "Thank you." "You're welcome," Jim replied. But life wasn't just the 2 of them learning to live together. The outside world had opinions, and those opinions weren't kind. The first time Jim rode into town with Nahate, he felt the stares like needles. People stopped talking when they passed. Women pulled their children closer. Men's hands moved to their gun belts. At the general store, the owner, Mr. Peterson, served Jim with tight lips and hard eyes. "Heard you took a Comanche woman to wife," Peterson said, not bothering to lower his voice. "That true?" "That's my business," Jim said evenly. "It's everyone's business when you bring a savage into civilized society," Peterson shot back. "Them Comanche killed plenty of good people. My own brother lost his wife to a raid 10 years back." Jim felt Nahate tense beside him. She understood the hate in Peterson's voice even if she didn't catch all the words. "She's not your enemy," Jim said. "She's just a person trying to live her life. Same as anyone." "Not same as anyone," Peterson said. "Not same at all. You want my advice? Send her back to wherever she came from before she brings trouble down on all of us." Jim gathered his supplies and left without another word. But the damage was done. Nahate had felt the hatred, the fear, the disgust. On the ride home, she was silent and withdrawn, back to how she'd been those first days. That night, Jim tried to explain. "Not everyone's like that," he said, though he wasn't sure it was true. "Some people, they're scared. They've lost folks to raids, and they take that anger out on anyone who looks like the ones who hurt them. It's not right, but it's how they are. Nahate looked at him, her eyes sad and ancient. She struggled to find the English words. My people, she said slowly, also lost. To your people. Many, many lost, Jim nodded. He'd seen abandoned Comanche camps, burned villages, people forced off land they'd lived on for generations. He knew both sides had blood on their hands. I know, he said quietly. I'm sorry for that. I'm sorry for all of it. She studied his face, looking for lies, finding none. You different, she finally said. Why? It was a good question. Why was he different? Jim thought about it. My parents, he said finally. They taught me that people are people. Doesn't matter what they look like or where they come from. What matters is how they treat others. Are they kind? Are they fair? That's what counts, he paused, old pain surfacing. They died when I was 17. Cholera swept through our town, killed a quarter of the people there, including both my folks. I was alone after that. Really alone, and I learned what it feels like to have nothing, to be nothing in other people's eyes. I guess I don't want anyone else to feel that way if I can help it. Nahate reached across the table then and put her hand on his. It was the first time she'd touched him voluntarily since that night with the raiders. Her hand was small and calloused from work. Thank you, she said again. But this time it meant more than thanks for a meal or a lesson. It meant thanks for seeing her as human. From that night on, things shifted between them. They weren't just two people stuck together by circumstance. They were becoming something like friends. Maybe even something more, though neither was ready to name it yet. Nahate started teaching Jim about her world. She showed him which plants could heal wounds and which could make you sick. She taught him tracking techniques that made hunting easier. She explained how her people read the sky to predict weather days in advance. Jim taught her more English, showed her how to handle the farm accounts, let her help with decisions about the ranch. He valued her opinion, asked for her input. She wasn't his property or his servant. She was his partner, even if they'd never said it out loud. But the peace couldn't last forever. One Sunday morning, a circuit preacher arrived at the homestead unannounced. He was a thin man with burning eyes and a voice that carried like thunder. Jim knew his type, the kind who saw sin everywhere and thought himself appointed by heaven to root it out. Brother Bridger, the preacher called out from his wagon, I've heard tell you're living with a woman without proper Christian vows. That's fornication, sir, a sin before God and man. Jim came out of the barn, wiping his hands on his pants. Nahate stood in the cabin doorway, watching. We're married, Jim said. Don Miguel Castillo witnessed it. A Catholic ceremony means nothing, the preacher declared. You need a proper Protestant marriage before God. Otherwise, you're living in sin, and this woman is nothing but your concubine. The word made Jim's blood boil, but he kept his voice calm. We're married. That's all that matters. The community sees otherwise, the preacher said. If you want to be part of civilized society, you'll do this right. Have a proper ceremony. Make honest vows. Otherwise, you're no better than the heathens themselves. After the preacher left, promising to return with paperwork and arrangements, Jim and Nahate sat at their table in heavy silence. The truth was, they'd never defined what they were to each other. They lived together, worked together, were building a life together. But were they really husband and wife? Or were they just two lonely people sharing space? What you think? Nahate asked in her careful English. We marry? Real marry? Jim looked at her, really looked at her. Somewhere along the way, this cautious woman with the guarded eyes had become the best part of his days. He looked forward to their evening lessons. He appreciated her quiet presence. He respected her strength. Maybe that was love. Or maybe it was just the beginning of it. I think, Jim said slowly, that we should decide what we want, not what the preacher wants or the town wants. What do you want, Nahate? She thought about it for a long time. I want choose, she finally said. Nobody give me. Nobody take me. I want choose. Then choose, Jim said. Whatever you decide, I'll respect it. Her answer would wait for another day, but the question hung between them, heavy with possibility. Spring came to the homestead with wildflowers and new calves. 3 months had passed since that first awkward day, and the cabin that once held two strangers now held something different. Not quite a couple, not quite just friends. Something in between that neither Jim nor Nahate had words for. Nahate's English improved every day. She could hold real conversations now, though she still searched for words sometimes. Jim learned a few Comanche phrases too, mostly practical things. His pronunciation was terrible, which made her smile. That smile, rare as it was, had become something Jim looked forward to earning. The homestead thrived in ways it never had when Jim worked alone. Nahate had knowledge he'd never imagined. She found a patch of wild onions growing near the creek and transplanted them closer to the cabin. She knew which berries were safe and which would make you sick. She could predict weather changes by watching birds and clouds. When one of the cows got an infection, she made a poultice from plants she gathered that worked better than anything Jim could have bought in town. "Where'd you learn all this?" Jim asked one evening as they worked together in the small garden she'd started. "My mother," Nahate said, her voice soft. "And her mother. And her mother before. Many generations. We learned to live with land, not fight it." It was the most she'd ever shared about her family. Jim didn't push for more, but he filed the information away. Every small piece she shared was a gift, a sign of growing trust. They developed rhythms and routines. Jim would wake first and start coffee. Nahate would emerge from behind the curtain and make breakfast while he tended the animals. They'd eat together at the small table, planning the day's work. Sometimes they'd work side by side. Other times they'd split tasks. But every evening they'd come back together for supper and their reading lessons. The Bible was nearly memorized now, at least the first few books. Nahate could read most words on sight. So Jim rode into town one day and traded 2 chickens for 3 more books. One was a farming manual, one was a collection of folk tales, and one, which cost him an extra chicken, was a book of maps showing the whole United States. Nahate loved the maps. She'd trace the lines with her finger, asking questions about places she'd never seen. "This is ocean?" she'd ask, pointing at the blue edge. "All water, no land?" "That's right. Water so far you can't see the other side." Her eyes would get wide. "I like to see someday." "Maybe someday you will," Jim would say, and mean it. But not everything was peaceful learning and shared work. The town's hostility hadn't faded. If anything, it had grown. When Jim went to town for supplies, he went alone now. It was easier that way. Less staring, less comments, less danger. One afternoon, Mrs. Patterson from the neighboring ranch stopped by unannounced. She was a solid woman in her 50s, widow of a man who'd been killed in a Comanche raid 20 years back. Jim's heart sank when he saw her wagon coming up the path. "Mr. Bridger," she said formally, not bothering with pleasantries. "I'm here to speak plainly, neighbor to neighbor." "Mrs. Patterson," Jim acknowledged. "What can I do for you?" "You can send that woman away before she brings destruction on us all." The older woman's face was hard. "We've worked too hard to build a civilized community here. We've lost too many people to Indian raids. Having one of them living among us, it's not right. It's not safe." Nahate was visible through the cabin window washing dishes. She'd heard the wagon and was keeping herself out of sight. But Jim knew she could hear everything. "With respect, ma'am, Nahate's not a threat to anyone. She's been here months without causing any trouble." "Yet," Mrs. Patterson said sharply, "you think she won't signal her people? Lead them here? We'll wake up one night with arrows flying and fire burning our homes." "Her people don't even know where she is," Jim said, trying to keep his voice level. "And even if they did, she's not some spy. She's just trying to live her life." "You're a fool, Bridger. A fool blinded by whatever hold that savage has on you. Mark my words, you'll regret this." She snapped the reins and her wagon lurched away. That night, Jim found Nahate outside, sitting on the porch steps, looking at the stars. Her face was wet with tears she quickly wiped away when she heard him approach. "Don't listen to her," Jim said, sitting beside her. "Mrs. Patterson's lost a lot. It's made her bitter." "She right, maybe," Nahate said quietly. "I bring you trouble. Town hates you because of me. Maybe better I go." "No," Jim said firmly. "Don't talk like that. This is your home now, same as mine. What the town thinks doesn't matter." "Everything mattered," Nahate said, her English failing her in her emotion. She switched to Comanche briefly, frustrated, then back to English. "You were respected before. Now people turn from you, because of me." Jim was quiet for a moment. She wasn't wrong. His life had been simpler before. Lonelier, but simpler. Now he was the town pariah, the man who'd chosen a Comanche woman over decent society. But when he looked at the life they'd built together, the partnership they'd formed, he couldn't regret it. "I don't want simple," Jim said. "I want this. This life with you in it. The town will come around or it won't. Either way, you're staying." She looked at him then, really looked at him, Something shifted in her eyes. "Why are you so good to me?" she asked, her voice barely a whisper. Jim thought about how to answer that. He could tell her about duty or honor or basic human decency. But the truth was simpler and more complicated than that. "Because you're worth being good to," he said finally. "Because in these months you've become important to me. Because I can't imagine this place without you anymore." The words hung in the air between them. It was the closest either had come to admitting what was growing between them. Nahati reached out and took his hand, just held it. They sat there in the darkness, hands linked, watching the stars. A week later, the circuit preacher returned with his paperwork and his Bible. Jim and Nahate had talked about it every night that week. What did they want? What did marriage mean to them? "In my tribe," Nahate had explained one night, "marriage is promise. Man and woman choose each other. They tell tribe, they make promises, they build lodge together. Not about paper. About choice and promise." "Here it's similar," Jim said. "But there's legal parts too. Papers that say you're protected, that you own half of everything I own, that no one can take you away or claim you as property anymore." That last part seemed to matter to her. The legal protection. The proof that she was a person with rights, not property to be traded. On Sunday morning, under a clear blue sky, they stood in front of the preacher with the Bible open. There were no guests. No celebration. Just two people making promises to each other while a stern man in black read from Scripture. "Do you, James Bridger, take this woman to be your lawfully wedded wife?" "I do," Jim said, meaning it. "And do you—" The preacher paused, looking at Nahate with barely concealed distaste. "Do you take this man as your husband?" Nahate looked at Jim. In her eyes, he saw the journey they'd taken together. From that first night when she wouldn't take food from his hand to this moment where she was choosing him freely. "I do," she said clearly. The preacher pronounced them married with all the enthusiasm of a man officiating a funeral, took his fee and left quickly, probably to pray for their souls. Alone again, Jim and Nahate looked at each other. Legally married now, but what did that mean for them? The cabin still had a curtain dividing it. They still slept separately. They still moved around each other with careful respect for personal space. "So," Jim said awkwardly, "I guess we're really married now." "Yes," Nahate agreed. Then after a pause, "What changes?" "I don't know," Jim admitted. "What do you want to change?" She considered this. "Not rush," she said finally. "We go slow, like before. Learn each other more. Then see." Relief flooded through Jim. "That sounds good, real good." They celebrated their wedding by working on the fence line together, talking about plans for the ranch, dreaming about maybe building a bigger barn next year. It wasn't romantic in the traditional sense, but it was real. It was them. That night, Nahate made a special meal using techniques from her tribe. She'd been gathering ingredients for days. The result was unlike anything Jim had tasted before, smoky and complex and delicious. "This is amazing," he said around a mouthful. She smiled, pleased. "My mother's recipe. She make for special days." After dinner, they sat on the porch as usual, but this time Nahate leaned against Jim's shoulder. It was a small gesture, but it meant everything. Permission to be closer, permission to start becoming something more than careful friends. "Thank you," she said softly, "for choosing me. For being patient. For seeing me." Jim put his arm around her shoulders, holding her gently. "Thank you for staying. For teaching me. For building this with me." They sat there as the sun set, two people from different worlds who'd found something rare and precious. Not a fairy tale romance, but something better. A partnership built on respect and growing into love. Whatever came next, they'd face it together. And that night, for the first time since arriving at the homestead, Nahate didn't have nightmares. She slept peacefully, finally beginning to feel safe, finally beginning to feel home. Summer came down on West Texas like a hammer. By late June, the grass had turned from green to brown. The creek that ran through Jim's land, usually reliable even in dry years, slowed to a trickle. By July, it was barely a muddy stream. By August, it was dust. Jim stood at the dried creek bed, wiping sweat from his forehead. Around him, his cattle looked thin and miserable. They needed water. They needed grass. They needed rain that refused to come. How bad? Nahate asked, coming up beside him. She'd been checking the well, which was still producing but dropping lower every day. "Bad," Jim admitted. "Lost 2 calves this week. If this keeps up, I'll lose a lot more than that." All around them, other ranchers were struggling too. Every day someone drove their herd to town to sell at terrible prices rather than watch them die. The Peterson place had already folded. The Martins were selling half their land. This drought was breaking people. But Nahate had been thinking. One evening she spread out Jim's map on the table, the one they'd used for her English lessons. She pointed to an area northwest of their land, deep in territory that used to be Comanche hunting grounds. Here, she said, hidden springs. My people used when rivers dried. Deep water, never stops. Jim looked at where she was pointing. It was a good 10 miles from their land through rough country. You sure they're still there? It's been years. Springs don't die, Nahate said with certainty. Water comes from deep earth. Always there. Jim trusted her knowledge, had learned to trust it over these months. But moving the entire herd that far was risky. The cattle were already weak. The journey might kill some of them. But staying here would definitely kill all of them. All right, Jim decided. We'll try it. Tomorrow morning, we move them. The next day before dawn they started driving the cattle northwest. It was brutal work. The animals were reluctant to leave what little grass remained near the homestead. The sun beat down mercilessly. Dust filled the air until breathing felt like swallowing dirt. Nahate led the way, riding ahead to scout the path. She moved with confidence through land that looked identical to Jim's eyes. But she saw markers he didn't. Read the landscape like a book. Here, a particular shaped rock. There, the way certain plants grew. She was finding her way home, in a sense, to places her people had known for generations. By midday, 2 older cows had collapsed. Jim had to put them down, hating every second of it. Each animal lost was money he couldn't afford to lose, food his family wouldn't have come winter. But he kept the herd moving, trusting Nahate's knowledge, hoping she was right. They reached the area she'd indicated by late afternoon. At first, Jim saw nothing but more dry land. His heart sank. Maybe the springs had dried up after all. Maybe this whole journey had been for nothing. But Nahate dismounted and walked into a cluster of rocks, disappearing from view. Jim followed, leading his horse. Behind the rocks was a narrow canyon he never would have found on his own. And at the bottom of that canyon, hidden from the sun, was water. Not just a little water, but pools of it, fed by springs bubbling up from deep underground. The water was cool and clear and beautiful. The cattle smelled it and surged forward, desperate. Jim and Nahate had to work to control them, to keep them from trampling each other in their eagerness to drink. But finally, every animal had water. They drank deeply, then stood in the shallow pools, cooling themselves, looking more content than they had in weeks. Jim turned to Nahate, overwhelmed with relief and gratitude. You saved them. You saved everything. She smiled, tired but pleased. I tell you, springs don't die. They made camp right there that night. The cattle weren't going anywhere, finally content with water and the sparse grass that grew around the springs. Jim and Nahate sat by their fire eating dried beef and watching the stars come out. This place, Nahate said quietly. My father brought me here when I was small. Taught me to find it. Said, land takes care of people who know how to listen. I was maybe 7 winters. It was the first time she'd mentioned her father. Jim stayed quiet, letting her share at her own pace. Good man, she continued. Strong, wise. He taught me tracking, plants, how to read sky and land. Said knowledge keeps you alive when nothing else can. She paused, pain flickering across her face. He died in raid. Same one where they took me. He fought to protect us, died so others could run. Jim reached over and took her hand. I'm sorry. He sounds like he was a good father. He was, Nahate agreed. I think he would like that his teaching saved your cattle. Saved our future. Our future. Jim noticed the word. Not his future or her future, but theirs together. Something warm spread through his chest at that. Over the next week, they established a routine. They'd drive the cattle to the springs every 3 days, let them drink and rest, then bring them back to the homestead. It was hard work, but it kept the herd alive when everyone else's were dying. Word spread about Jim's miraculous water source. People got curious, some got jealous. One afternoon, 3 men from town rode up while Jim and Nahate were preparing to move the herd again. Jim recognized them. Ben Crawford, Tom Willis, and Henry Shaw. Local ranchers, all struggling like everyone else. Bridger, Crawford called out. We need to talk. Jim walked over, wary. These men had never been friendly, especially after he'd married Nahate. What about? Heard you found water, Willis said. Good water. We want to know where. Private land, Jim said carefully. Not mine to share. Now that's not neighborly, Shaw said, his voice hard. We're all suffering here. You find water, you should share it. That's the Christian thing to do. Jim felt his temper rise. These same men had shunned him for months, called Nahate horrible names, made his life difficult. Now they wanted his help, but he also understood their desperation. They were watching their livelihoods die same as he had been. The water's not on my land, Jim explained. It's in territory that might still be claimed by Comanche bands. I can't just give anyone directions to go there. Your woman knows where it is, though, don't she? Crawford said, looking past Jim to where Nahate stood by the house. That savage is using her people's knowledge to help you while the rest of us suffer. Don't call her that, Jim said, his voice dropping to a dangerous level. What? Savage, that's what she is. And you're a traitor for choosing her over your own kind. People are starting to say maybe you should lose your land, lose your water rights, since you won't help the community. Jim's hand moved to his gun. You threatening me, Crawford? The three men tensed. For a moment, violence hung in the air like the dust. Then Nahate's voice cut through the tension. I show you, she said, walking over. I show springs. But you respect land. Take only what you need. No camps, no fires. Water only, then leave. Promise this. The men looked at her with surprise and suspicion. Why would you help us? Willis asked. Because cattle dying not their fault, Nahate said simply. Not your fault. Not our fault. Drought just is. No reason good animals should die because people are proud. Her English had improved so much, Jim thought with pride, and her wisdom put these men to shame. Crawford shifted uncomfortably. All right. We promise. Water only, then we leave. Nahate gave them directions, detailed and clear. The men left without thanks, but Jim knew they'd use the information. It might not make them like Nahate more, but at least their cattle would survive. You didn't have to do that, Jim said after they'd gone. They don't deserve your help. Maybe not, Nahate agreed. But land does not belong to anyone. Water does not belong to anyone. These are gifts from Earth for all creatures. My people understood this. Your people. Sometimes they forget. That night, as they lay under the stars with the herd settled peacefully around them, Jim pulled Nahate close. They'd been sleeping beside each other for weeks now, the careful distance between them gradually closing. Tonight she rested her head on his chest, listening to his heartbeat. Why do you stay? Jim asked suddenly. Really? You could leave any time. Find your people, go back to your old life. Why stay with me? Nahate was quiet for a long time. At first, she said slowly, I stayed because I had nowhere else. Then I stayed because you were kind and kindness was rare. But now, she propped herself up to look at him. Now I stay because this is home. You are home. We built this together. Why would I leave what I helped build? Jim kissed her then, really kissed her for the first time. It was gentle and sweet and full of promise. When they pulled apart, both were smiling. I love you, Jim said. The words felt right. Felt true. I love you too. Nahate replied in English, then repeated it in Comanche, the words flowing like water. The drought broke 2 weeks later. Rain came in torrents, filling the dry creek beds, turning the brown grass green again. The cattle thrived, put on weight, looked healthy again. Jim's herd had survived better than any other in the region, thanks to Nahate's knowledge. But success brought new attention. One morning, a well-dressed rider approached the homestead. He introduced himself as William Foster, a cattle buyer from San Antonio. He'd heard about Jim's herd, how healthy they were despite the drought. He was prepared to offer premium prices for breeding stock. It was an opportunity Jim couldn't have imagined a year ago. With this money, they could expand, maybe buy more land, really establish themselves. As they negotiated, Foster kept glancing at Nahate, who was working in her garden. Autumn painted the land in golden orange. Jim and Nahate's homestead was thriving. The cattle were fat and healthy. Their small herd had grown with new calves. The house had a new room added on. Life was good, better than Jim had ever imagined, but something had changed in Nahate. She'd grown quieter over the past few weeks, more distant. Jim would catch her staring at the horizon, her face filled with longing. At night, she'd wake from dreams speaking Comanche, words tumbling out fast and urgent. One morning, Jim found her sitting outside before dawn, wrapped in a blanket, crying silently. He sat beside her without speaking, just offering presence. After a while, she leaned against him. "I had dream," she said quietly. "About my brother. Swift Arrow, he was calling me, needed me. Felt so real. Jim had known she had family somewhere. She'd mentioned a younger brother once or twice, always with pain in her voice. How old was he when you were taken?" "Maybe 12 winters," Nahate said. "I was 16. I tried to protect him during raid. Told him to run and hide. I don't know if he made it. Don't know if he alive or dead. 5 years, Jim. 5 years of not knowing." The weight of that uncertainty sat heavy between them. Jim tried to imagine not knowing if his own family had survived, being torn away without answers. The pain of it was unimaginable. "Do you want to find out?" Jim asked. "Try to find him?" Nahate looked at him with surprise. "How Comanche bands move. I don't know where they are now." "Could be anywhere from here to the mountains." "We could try," Jim said. "There's Comanche trading parties that come through sometimes. We could ask, send messages. Someone might know something." Hope and fear warred on Nahate's face. "You would help me?" "Could be dangerous. Your people don't trust Comanche. Comanche don't trust your people. You're my wife," Jim said simply. "Your family is my family. If there's a chance your brother's alive, we should try to find out." 3 weeks later, word came through a Mexican trader that a Comanche band would be camping near the Rio Grande for fall trading. They were known to trade peacefully with settlers who approached with respect. It was the best chance they'd have. Jim and Nahate prepared carefully. They brought gifts, blankets, knives, coffee, sugar, things that would show good intentions. They also brought their marriage papers and letters from the preacher, hoping documentation might protect them if things went wrong. The journey took 4 days. As they rode south and west, Nahate grew more animated. She pointed out landmarks, shared memories. "Here, our band camped one winter. Made shelter in those rocks. There, my father taught me to hunt deer. This tree we held ceremony under." She was going home, Jim realized. Even if her people weren't there anymore, the land remembered her. She remembered it. When they finally saw the Comanche camp, Jim's heart pounded. There were maybe 60 people with horses grazing nearby. Tipis stood in organized clusters. Children played. Women worked on hides. Men sat in groups, talking and working on weapons. It looked peaceful, but Jim knew how fast that could change. "Let me speak first," Nahate said. "Stay behind me. Show no weapons." They approached slowly, hands visible. A group of warriors rode out to intercept them. Jim's hand wanted to go to his gun, but he forced it to stay still. Everything depended on these next moments. Nahate spoke in Comanche, her voice clear and strong. Jim couldn't understand the words, but he heard pride in her tone. She gestured to herself, to Jim, explaining their presence. The warriors listened, their faces hard to read. One older warrior, his hair streaked with gray, suddenly sat up straighter. He said something sharp, a question. Nahate answered, and the man's eyes went wide. He shouted something to the camp, and people started emerging from teepees, gathering to see. "What's happening?" Jim whispered. "They know my family name," Nahate said, her voice shaking. "They're checking if anyone from my band survived." An older woman pushed through the crowd, walking slowly with a cane. She stared at Nahate, reached out and touched her face like she couldn't believe what she was seeing. Then she started crying, pulling Nahate into an embrace. They spoke rapidly in Comanche, both crying, both laughing. "My aunt," Nahate explained to Jim, switching between English and Comanche. "My mother's sister. She says Swift Arrow is alive. He's here. He's here in this camp." A young man emerged from one of the larger teepees. He was tall and strong, maybe 17 now with their mother's eyes. He stopped dead when he saw Nahate. For a moment, they just stared at each other. Then Nahate ran to him, and they collided in an embrace that nearly knocked them both over. Jim stood back, giving them space, feeling like an intruder in this reunion. But he was also filled with joy for Nahate. She'd found her brother. After 5 years of not knowing, she had answers. The camp welcomed them cautiously. Jim was the only white man there, and trust didn't come easy. But Nahate's presence, her family connection, bought him safety. They were given food, a place to sit. Nahate and Swift Arrow talked for hours, catching up on lost years. Swift Arrow's story was hard to hear. He'd survived the raid by hiding like Nahate told him to. He'd watched from concealment as his parents died defending their people. After the raid, he'd wandered alone for days before another band found him and took him in. They'd raised him as their own. "I thought you were dead," Swift Arrow said in halting English, learned from traders. "I saw them take you." Thought I'd never see you again. I thought same about you, Nahate replied, still holding his hand like she was afraid he'd disappear. Over the next 3 days, Jim and Nahate stayed with the band. Jim learned more about Comanche life, seeing it from the inside rather than through fear and prejudice. They were people just like any others. They loved their children, told stories, laughed, argued, lived. The only difference was language and customs. But Jim also felt Nahate pulling away from him. Not in love, but in belonging. She fit here in a way she'd never quite fit at the homestead. She spoke her language freely, wore traditional clothes her aunt gave her, participated in women's work with easy familiarity. This was her world, her people. Jim was the outsider here. On the 3rd night, Jim and Nahate sat apart from the camp, looking at stars. She was quiet, conflicted. Jim could see the war happening inside her. You want to stay? Jim said. It wasn't a question. Nahate's eyes filled with tears. I don't know what I want. I love you, Jim. I love life we built. But this is my family. My brother. I've spent 5 years not knowing if he was alive. Now he's here, and I can't imagine leaving him again. Jim's heart was breaking, but he kept his voice steady. Then stay, she looked at him sharply. What? Stay, Jim repeated. If this is where you need to be, then stay. I won't hold you to vows you made when you had no other choice. You're free, Nahate. You've always been free. But what about homestead? The cattle? Everything we built? It's just land and animals, Jim said, even though it hurt to say it. You're more important than any of that. If staying here makes you happy, then that's what matters. Nahate started crying in earnest now. How can you say that?
How can you let me go so easy?
Because I love you, Jim said simply. Real love means wanting the other person's happiness, even if it's not with you. I'd rather you be happy here than miserable with me. They sat in silence for a long time. Around them, the camp was settling for the night. Fires burned low. Children's laughter faded. The peaceful sounds of people living their lives. Finally, Nahate spoke. I don't want to stay without you. Jim looked at her, confused. What? I want... She struggled to find the words. I want both. Can I have both? Can I keep you and keep them? I don't know how that would work, Jim admitted. We visit, Nahate said, the idea forming as she spoke. We come see Swift Arrow, bring gifts, trade. We build bridge between worlds. I teach you more Comanche. You teach him more English. Our children, when we have them, they know both worlds. They belong to both, Jim thought about it. It would be complicated. Dangerous sometimes. The prejudice from both sides wouldn't disappear overnight. But maybe, just maybe, it could work. If that's what you want, Jim said, then that's what we'll do. Nahate kissed him then, fierce and grateful. That's what I want. I choose you, Jim, but I also choose not to lose my brother again. Can we have both? We can try, Jim promised. We'll figure it out together. The next morning, they prepared to leave. Swift Arrow wasn't happy about Nahate leaving again, but he understood. He was also wary of Jim, protective of his sister. Who was this white man who'd married her? Could he be trusted? Jim and Swift Arrow sat together before the departure, communicating in broken English and Comanche with Nahate translating when needed. You treat her good? Swift Arrow asked bluntly. I try, Jim said. She's taught me as much as I've taught her. We're partners. You bring her back? Let her visit? As often as she wants, Jim promised. Your sister is free to make her own choices. Always. Swift Arrow studied him for a long moment, then nodded. I still don't trust white men. Too many have lied, have killed our people. But my sister trusts you. That means something. You break that trust, I will find you. It was a threat, but Jim respected it. Fair enough. They made plans to return in the spring. Swift Arrow's band would be in the area for trading. They could meet again, stay longer. Maybe by then Swift Arrow would trust Jim a bit more. Maybe Jim would understand Comanche ways better. Small steps toward bridging two worlds. Winter came early that year. Nahate was 5 months pregnant, her belly round and growing. She glowed with health and happiness, spending her days preparing for the baby while Jim worked on finishing the nursery. They'd painted the new room yellow, like sunshine. It felt hopeful, warm, a fresh start. Everything felt right until the day Eduardo Castillo rode up to their homestead with 2 men in suits and a sheriff Jim didn't recognize. Eduardo had changed since that day at the hacienda. He looked thinner, harder, desperate around the eyes, the kind of desperate that made men dangerous. Bridger, Eduardo called out, not bothering to dismount. "We need to talk." Jim came out of the barn, wiping his hands on his pants. Nahate appeared in the doorway of the cabin, her hand instinctively going to her belly. "What's this about, Eduardo?" "It's about your wife," Eduardo said, and something in his tone made Jim's blood run cold. "Or should I say my property?" The word hung in the air like poison. Jim's hand moved to his gun. "Watch your mouth. That's my wife you're talking about." One of the suited men stepped forward. He had the smooth, oily look of a lawyer. "Mr. Bridger, my name is Charles Whitmore. I represent Eduardo Castillo in a legal matter concerning the woman known as Nahate. My client has documentation proving she was his legitimate property, obtained through legal means during a sanctioned raid on a hostile Comanche camp. His father, Don Miguel, had no right to give her away as she did not belong to him." Jim felt the ground shift under his feet. "That's crazy. Don Miguel gave her to me. I have papers." "Papers from a man who had no ownership," Whitmore said smoothly. "My client has the original bill of sale from the raid. Under territorial law, she remains his property unless legally purchased. The marriage is therefore invalid, as she could not consent to marriage while being held property." "That's a lie," Jim said, his voice shaking with rage. "She was freed when Don Miguel gave her to me. We got married proper, with a preacher and witnesses." Eduardo finally spoke, his voice bitter. "My father destroyed my life when he gave away what was mine. I've lost everything, Bridger. My inheritance, my respect, my future, all because he wanted to reward you for saving my life. Well, I've come to collect what's mine." The sheriff, a heavy man with tired eyes, finally spoke up. "Mr. Bridger, I'm Sheriff Thompson from the county seat. I'm here to make sure this stays peaceful. Judge has ordered a hearing. Both parties will present their case. Until then, the woman needs to come with us." "Like hell she does," Jim said, moving to stand between them and the cabin. "She's pregnant. You're not taking her anywhere. The law—" Whitmore started. "The law says she's a person, not property," Jim interrupted. "We ended slavery. Or did everyone forget that? That applied to African slaves," Whitmore said. "Different laws govern captured hostiles. She was taken in a raid on a hostile camp. That makes her a legitimate captive." Nahate had been silent until now, but she stepped forward, her English clear and strong. "I was not hostile. I was gathering plants with my mother when raiders came. They killed my parents, took me prisoner. How is that legal?" Eduardo's face twisted. "You're Comanche. Your people raided us for years, killed settlers, stole cattle. You got what you deserved." "My people defended their land," Nahate shot back. "You came into our territory. We fought to survive. Same as you." "Enough," Sheriff Thompson said, raising his hand. "Save it for the judge. Miss, you need to come with us pending the hearing. That's the law." Jim stepped closer to Nahate, his hand finding hers. "What if she runs? What if she disappears? You can't prosecute someone who isn't here." Nahate squeezed his hand hard. "No," she said firmly. "I run, they say I'm guilty. We fight this right. Show them we are real marriage, real life. Show them I am person, not thing." Her courage broke Jim's heart and filled it at the same time. She was right, but that didn't make it easier. "I'm coming with her," Jim said. "Wherever you're taking her, I'm coming too." Thompson nodded. "Fair enough. Pack what you need. Hearings in 3 days in town." Those 3 days felt like 3 years. Nahate was kept in a room at the boarding house, essentially under house arrest. Jim stayed in the next room, allowed to see her during daylight hours but separated at night. The baby kicked constantly like it knew something was wrong. The whole town buzzed with gossip. The Comanche woman and the cowboy who married her. The property dispute. The question of whether their marriage was even valid. People took sides. Some surprisingly supported Jim. Others thought Eduardo had a right to his property. Most just enjoyed the drama. Jim spent those 3 days gathering evidence. He talked to the preacher who'd married them. He got sworn statements from the few people who'd witnessed their marriage. He even tracked down William Foster, the cattle buyer, who wrote a letter saying Nahate had proven herself a valuable and intelligent partner to Jim, capable of making her own decisions. Nahate spent the time writing her own statement, with Jim's help polishing the English. She told her story from the beginning. The raid, her captivity, Jim's choice to free her, their life together, her pregnancy. She held nothing back, determined that the truth would speak for itself. On the morning of the hearing, the courthouse was packed. Every seat filled, people standing in the back. Jim recognized faces from town, neighboring ranchers, People who'd never spoken to him before but wanted to witness this spectacle. The judge was an older man named Harrison Webb. He'd been a Union officer during the war, people said, and had a reputation for being fair but harsh. His face gave nothing away as he surveyed the crowded courtroom. "This is a hearing to determine ownership and marital status," Judge Webb began, his voice carrying authority. "Mr. Whitmore, present your case." Eduardo's lawyer stood smooth and confident. He presented papers documenting the raid where Nahate was captured. Records showing Eduardo had paid the raid leader for her. Bills of sale. Witnesses who confirmed Eduardo had held her as property for 3 years before his father gave her away. "Your Honor," Whitmore said, "this is a simple case of stolen property. Don Miguel Castillo, while meaning well, gave away what was not his to give. My client has suffered tremendous financial hardship as a result. The woman represents significant value, and under territorial law, she remains his property unless Mr. Bridger can show legal purchase." Jim felt sick listening to Nahate described like a horse or a piece of furniture, but worse was watching her face stay blank, hiding the hurt underneath. "Mr. Bridger," Judge Webb said. "Your response?" Jim stood, hands shaking slightly. He wasn't good with words, not like fancy lawyers, but he had to try. "Your Honor, I never thought of Nahate as property. When Don Miguel offered me a reward, he said I could choose any woman in his household to marry. I chose her. I freed her. We got married legal and proper. But she wasn't Don Miguel's to give," Whitmore interrupted. "Therefore the marriage is invalid." Judge Webb held up his hand for silence. "I'll decide what's valid," Mr. Bridger continue. "We've built a life together," Jim said. "A real marriage. She's pregnant with our child. She's not property. She's a person with thoughts and feelings and rights. The war ended slavery. How is this different?" "Because Comanche are not citizens," Whitmore said. "They're hostiles captured in warfare. Different laws apply." Judge Webb leaned forward. "Let's hear from the woman herself." "Miss, step forward." Nahate rose slowly, her pregnant belly obvious. She walked to the front with her head high, refusing to show fear even though Jim could see her hands trembling. "State your name," Judge Webb said. "Nahate," she said clearly, "daughter of Two Rivers and Morning Bird of the Penataka Band. And you understand the nature of these proceedings?" "Yes, this man," she pointed at Eduardo, "and claims he owns me. Says I am property, but I am person. I think, I feel, I choose. Property does not choose. Tell the court about your capture," Judge Webb said. Nahate took a breath and began. She described the raid in detail. How she'd been gathering medicine plants with her mother. How the raiders came at dawn. How her father died defending their people. How she was shackled and taken, along with 3 other women and 5 children. "They kept us in chains," she said, her voice steady but her eyes distant with memory. "Beat us when we spoke our language. Starved us when we resisted. For 3 years I lived in Eduardo's household. I was slave in everything but name. I had no freedom, no choice, no voice." "That's not true," Eduardo protested. "We fed you, clothed you, gave you shelter. You gave me survival," Nahate said, looking at him directly. "Not life. There is difference." Judge Webb was quiet for a moment. "Continue." "Then Jim chose me," Nahate said, and her voice softened. "He could have chosen anyone. Pretty women in nice dresses who spoke his language. But he chose me. And when we left, he removed my chains. Gave me freedom to leave if I wanted. I didn't understand at first. Thought it was trick. But he meant it." She described their journey home. The incident with the raiders. Jim giving her his blanket and sleeping by the fire. He treated me like person from beginning. Asked what I wanted. Listened to my words. Taught me to read. Shared his land like it was ours together, not his alone. "And the marriage?" Judge Webb asked. "Was my choice," Nahate said firmly. "Preacher came. Said we needed proper ceremony. Jim asked what I wanted. I could have said no. Could have left. But I said yes. I chose to marry him. I chose this life." Spring arrived with new life everywhere. The winter had been hard, but they'd survived it together. Now the land was green again. Flowers bloomed, and Nahate was days away from giving birth. She moved slowly around the cabin, one hand always on her huge belly. Jim watched her like a hawk, ready to help with everything. She found it both sweet and annoying. "I am pregnant, not broken," she'd tell him with a smile when he tried to carry water for her. "I know, but let me help anyway," he'd reply. Their daughter arrived on a warm April morning. The birth was hard but quick. Nahate was strong, determined, just like everything else she did. When the baby finally came, crying loud and healthy, Jim wept with relief and joy. They named her Hope. It seemed fitting. She represented everything they'd fought for, everything they'd built together. A child of two worlds belonging to both and neither. Hope had Jim's blue eyes and Nahate's dark hair. She was beautiful and perfect and changed everything. Jim had never known he could love something so completely, so immediately. Watching Nahate nurse their daughter, singing to her in Comanche, he felt his heart might burst. The town's reaction to Hope was mixed. Some people softened when they saw the baby, because babies had a way of making people remember their humanity. Others remained hostile, seeing Hope as proof of what they considered an unnatural union. Jim stopped caring what people thought. His family was what mattered. When Hope was 2 months old, they made the journey to visit Swift Arrow's band. It was important to Nahate that her brother meet his niece, that Hope know her Comanche family. The journey was harder with a baby, but they managed. Swift Arrow's face when he saw Hope was something Jim would never forget. The young warrior went soft immediately, holding his tiny niece with such careful reverence. "She looks like our mother," he said in Comanche, translated by Nahate. "Same eyes when she looks at you, like she sees into your spirit." They stayed with the band for 2 weeks. Hope was celebrated, welcomed, blessed by elders. Jim watched his daughter be embraced by this community that had once seemed so foreign to him. Now he saw them as extended family, people who would help protect and raise his child. Swift Arrow and Jim's relationship improved during that visit. They hunted together, worked together, talked late into the night with Nahate translating. Swift Arrow was still cautious, still protective of his sister, but he could see that Jim loved her, that their family was real and strong. "You are not what I expected," Swift Arrow admitted one night. "Most white men I know are greedy or violent or both. But you treat my sister like equal. You honor her knowledge. You learn our ways without disrespect." "She's my partner," Jim said simply. "Can't honor her without honoring where she comes from." Before they left, Swift Arrow gave Hope a gift. A small leather pouch containing items for protection and blessing. "Tell her about us," he said to Jim, "when she's old enough. Tell her about her people, both sides. Let her be proud of all she is." "I will," Jim promised. "She'll know both worlds, years past." The homestead grew into a proper ranch. Jim and Nahate added 2 more children to their family. A son they named River, and another daughter named Star. All 3 children grew up speaking both English and Comanche, learning both cultures, belonging to both worlds. Hope became Jim's right hand on the ranch as she grew. By age 12, she could ride rope and work cattle as well as any grown hand. But she also knew medicinal plants, could track game through any terrain, and understood the land in ways Jim never would. River was quieter, thoughtful, always reading the books Jim bought from traveling merchants. Star was the wildfire, never still, always laughing, making friends with everyone she met. The town changed too, slowly. Judge Webb's ruling had set a precedent that rippled outward. Other mixed marriages happened, though not many. More people began to question the old hatreds, the old fears. It wasn't perfect. There were still people who crossed the street to avoid the Bridger family, still whispers and prejudice. But there was also growing acceptance. Jim and Nahate became bridge builders without meaning to. Nahate helped establish peaceful trading relationships between local ranchers and Comanche bands. Jim used his standing to advocate for fair treatment of indigenous people in territorial meetings. Their children, moving easily between both worlds, showed others it was possible. On their 10th anniversary, Jim and Nahate stood on the porch of their expanded house, watching their children play in the yard. Hope was teaching her younger siblings to braid rope. Their laughter carried on the warm breeze. "Did you ever imagine this?" Jim asked, taking Nahate's hand. "That first night when we camped under the stars, could you have imagined all this?" Nahate smiled, lines crinkling around her eyes. She was in her early 30s now, still beautiful but worn by hard work and childbearing in the way of frontier women. "No, I imagined running away, or enduring, or maybe dying. I didn't imagine happiness, didn't imagine family, didn't imagine home. But this is home now?" Jim asked, though he knew the answer. "This is home," Nahate confirmed. "Not because of place, because of people, you, our children. This life we built together. That's what makes home." Jim pulled her close, kissed her temple. 10 years of marriage. Not always easy, but always worth it. They'd faced drought, prejudice, legal battles, and the daily struggles of frontier life. They'd survived it all by standing together. More years passed. Hope grew into a young woman who caught the eye of every young man for miles around. But she was particular, having seen her parents' partnership. She wanted someone who would treat her as equal, who would honor both sides of her heritage. She eventually married a Mexican rancher's son who loved her fierce independence and respected her mixed heritage. River became a teacher, moving to a larger town where he could get proper education, then returning to teach both white and indigenous children. His school became known for being a place where all children learned together, regardless of background. Star, true to her name, shone brightly but briefly in their lives. She died at 16 from a fever that took her fast. Despite everything Nahate knew about healing, her loss devastated them all. But even in grief, Jim and Nahate held each other up. They'd learned long ago that life gave both joy and sorrow, and you needed to accept both. Jim's hair went gray, then white. His hands became gnarled with arthritis, but he still worked the ranch every day, now with Hope's husband and River's sons helping. Nahate's hair silvered too, and her back ached from years of hard labor. But her mind stayed sharp, her spirit undiminished. Swift Arrow visited regularly over the years, watching his nieces and nephews grow. He eventually married and had children of his own. His kids and Jim's grandkids played together, speaking both languages, seeing each other as family rather than enemies. It was a small healing, but healing nonetheless. One evening, when Jim was in his 60s and Nahate in her 50s, they sat on their porch watching sunset paint the sky in gold and purple. Their grandchildren were visiting, 4 of them, ranging from age 3 to 10. Nahate was teaching the oldest one, Hope's daughter, a traditional Comanche song about the stars. The girl's voice was sweet and pure, the words flowing in a language Jim still didn't fully understand, but had learned to appreciate. Her younger siblings sat quiet, listening. Hope and her husband worked in the garden. River's wife cooked dinner inside, the smell of food drifting through the open window. "This is what we fought for," Jim said quietly to Nahate. "This right here. This moment." "Yes," Nahate agreed, watching her granddaughter sing. "We fought so they wouldn't have to, so they could just live, just be, without choosing sides or hiding who they are." "Do you think it worked?" Jim asked. "Did we make things better?" Nahate thought about it. "For our family, yes. We made things better. For the world?" She shrugged. "Maybe a little. Maybe we showed it's possible to love across divides. Maybe our grandchildren will show their children. Maybe that's how change happens." Slowly, family by family, person by person, Jim nodded. It wasn't the grand change he might have hoped for in his younger years. Prejudice still existed. Conflicts between settlers and indigenous peoples continued. But here, in this small corner of Texas, 2 people from different worlds had built something that worked. They'd raised children who belonged to both worlds and felt ashamed of neither. They'd created a family that proved love was stronger than hate. As the sun set completely and stars began appearing, Nahate finished teaching the song. Her granddaughter sang it through once more, perfect and proud. The little girl looked up at her grandmother with adoration. "Tell me the story again, grandmother," she said, "about how grandfather chose you." It was her favorite story, one all the grandchildren loved. The tale of the rich man who offered any bride, and the cowboy who chose the shackled Comanche girl, a story that seemed impossible but was true. Nahate pulled the child onto her lap and began. "Many years ago, your grandfather saved a boy's life." Jim listened to his wife tell their story once again, never tiring of hearing it. Each time she told it, she emphasized different parts. The choice, the freedom, the respect, the love that grew slowly, carefully into something unbreakable. When she finished, the little girl asked, "Were you scared, grandmother, when grandfather chose you?" "Terrified," Nahate admitted. "I didn't understand why he would choose me.